I'd like to start tonight by recognizing that we are on the unceded land of the Abenaki people. The Abenaki have always been and continue to be a thriving Indigenous culture in the region. We acknowledge the land and the people, and we are grateful for their generations of stewardship, past and present. Thank you so much to Vermont Humanities and to Brownell Library for having me tonight. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Susan Evans McClure. I'm the Executive Director at Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. And while I spend my days now thinking about Lake Champlain, in a previous life, as Sarah said, I was the Director of Food History Programs at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where I explored how what we eat and how we grow it and what we drink help us understand American history. So tonight, I'll be talking with you all about that history of why we eat what we eat at Thanksgiving, which happens to be my favorite holiday, and one that hopefully this year will be bringing people back together safely around Thanksgiving tables. So we are not all around a table today. We're all around our computers. But if you'd like to, in the spirit of pretending we're around a table, just hop in the chat and mention, I would love everyone to share the town where they have Thanksgiving, the name of the town where they eat Thanksgiving dinner, and their favorite Thanksgiving dessert. If you'd like to do that, you can just put it in the chat now. And speaking of the chat, Sarah also mentioned to put your questions in the chat, and we will get to those at the, we'll do those at the end too. I definitely see a chocolate pie mentioned, which was brought up at my dinner table tonight by my husband and son, who were advocating for chocolate pie for dessert, which I was not something my family ever had, but it is a tradition in my husband's family. All right, keep the pies coming, and I will talk a bit about the museum. So we'll just say a little bit about Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. This is our 3-acre waterfront campus located just outside of Vergennes, Vermont. We are a museum dedicated to inspiring people to make personal connections to Lake Champlain through our region's history, ecology, and archaeology. We believe that when people see themselves in our past, they make a stronger commitment to building a healthy future for all of us and for the lake and for our communities. The museum opened in 1985, and today we welcome about 10,000 students and visitors to experience our exhibits, our boat building and rowing programs, and our educational outreach. Our archaeological team is also conducting new research and stewarding our collection of objects, research materials, and archives. The COVID-19 pandemic and the National Reckoning on Racial Justice have given us at the museum a chance to really assess what is important to us and what we want to achieve in partnership with our community. And to us, it's all about access. The lake and the history that lies within it belong to the people of Vermont and New York. And we want to make it possible for everyone to experience that for themselves with no barriers to that access. So we no longer charge admission to the museum, and all of our summer camps are on a pay-what-you-can model. And we're also taking steps to make our campus and our programs more physically accessible. And we work to make the lake and the lake's underwater resources and shipwrecks more accessible to everyone too. We open again for the 2022 season on May 22nd. And until then, you can visit us and our exhibits online. All right, I'm going to revisit our pies list because not just pies, desserts list, because dessert is my favorite part of Thanksgiving. And I'm seeing a lot of good apple pie, pumpkin pie, mocha pecan pie. Never had that, but I want it. Pumpkin cheesecake. What else do we have on here? Pumpkin pie. Patty says all the pies, which I respect. And lots of other good. Oh, chess pie. That's a great one. Thank you for sharing all of your pies. There's so many great parts of Thanksgiving, and one of them is the pie. And we'll talk about pie tonight. So no American holiday conjures up images and memories of food like Thanksgiving. Starting in preschool, most of us learned that Thanksgiving commemorates the moment in 1621 when pilgrims sat down for a peaceful meal with their Indian neighbors and friends. They wore funny hats and buckle shoes that are conveniently easy to replicate out of construction paper. They ate turkey, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and stuffing, just like I ate with my family every year after watching the Thanksgiving Day parade. However, since the mid-20th century, historians have really gone to great lengths proving how little of this story actually happened. Nonetheless, the Thanksgiving meal as we know it today is a cornerstone of our national identity. But why pie? And why turkey? And why that inescapable canned cranberry sauce? And what is the deal with Pilgrim salt and pepper shakers? In putting together this presentation, I really just went to Google and put Thanksgiving salt and pepper shakers in to Google Images, and thousands upon thousands upon thousands of images of Thanksgiving salt and pepper shakers popped up. I went down a really deep rabbit hole on this, and here are a few of the highlights, but there were so many more. And maybe you all have some Thanksgiving salt and pepper shakers at home too. But beyond the salt and pepper shakers, what we choose to remember about the past often says more about America than what actually happened. Thanksgiving betrays a need, which we see throughout American history, to create a shared national identity. And then in this case, the way we have addressed that hunger is by creating shared food traditions, carving up the essentials of the Thanksgiving plate. There will be a lot of food puns in this presentation, so please prepare yourselves. Carving up the essentials of the Thanksgiving plate reveals that how Americans have always created and continue to create new traditions that reflect the needs of a modern day society without abandoning the traditions of the past, some of which we just created for ourselves too. And because very little is actually known about what happened at the first Thanksgiving, we've been free to commemorate it based on what we as a nation have needed it and wanted it to look like over time. Often that's been very complicated. So every single thing that we know about the foods of the first Thanksgiving is based on what foods were common in the region at that time, and a letter written by Edward Winslow to a friend in England describing the feast in 1621. The letter was published actually without Winslow knowing that it was going to be published, but it was published in 1622 in a pamphlet called Morth's Relation, a journal of the Pilgrims in Plymouth. The pamphlet it kind of disappears and reappears, goes in and out of print in the early 1700s. But in his letter, Winslow wrote of a feast in the fall with the Wampanoag Indians. He wrote, and I'll read from his letter, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling, that so we might after have a special manner rejoice together after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst other recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and among the rest, their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed to our governor and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God, we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." So that was it, one letter. And from there, a whole holiday was born. When the Pilgrims arrived in North America, they arrived on the land of the Wampanoag indigenous people. The Wampanoag lived in what is now Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And in the 1600s, there were around 40,000 Wampanoag people living in about 70 villages throughout that area of what's now Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The story of what was enacted on the Wampanoag people is truly tragic, and somehow that never makes it to the Thanksgiving table. In fact, the Pilgrims were not the first Europeans to arrive in the Wampanoag homeland. 5 years before the Pilgrims got there, British sailors arrived to fish and to capture Indians into the slave trade. These British sailors also brought diseases with them that wiped out the Wampanoag. And if that weren't enough, the people who didn't die of disease, many of them, they took them, enslaved them, and took them away. So within the 5 years between the British sailors arriving and then the Pilgrims arriving in 1621, 90% of the Wampanoag people died of diseases that had been brought by the British. When the Pilgrims arrived in 1621, they found completely emptied villages. And they actually took it as a sign from God that they were meant to inhabit this place, that when they arrived, there were empty villages just waiting for them. The Wampanoag that the Pilgrims did encounter were also at war with the Narragansett people. So the Pilgrims actually exchanged their guns for food from the Wampanoag. So the story of sharing food with the Indians that we have all learned was actually that the Pilgrims were trading food for guns. We're trading guns for food. They had the guns, but they didn't have, and they couldn't grow any of their own food. And Thanksgiving rituals were a part of Wampanoag life. There was a tradition and still is a tradition of Thanksgiving as part of a seasonal and family gatherings. And the Wampanoag still exists today. A common myth perpetuated by colonizing forces throughout American history has been that Indians are gone. But the Wampanoag, like the Abenaki in Vermont, are still very much here. This image is of the Wampanoag Nation singers and dancers in 2011 at Salt Pond at the Cape Cod National Seashore. So there was a Thanksgiving in 1621, and it was with the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, but what did they actually eat? This image was painted in the early 20th century and is titled The First Thanksgiving. And there are just so many things wrong with this image that I'm not even really sure where to start. First of all, the Wampanoag don't wear headdresses like that. The Pilgrim women were not the ones who knew how to cook and serve the food. And the imagery of a motherly pilgrim bestowing food upon a lowly Indian perpetuates the myth that Indians were less than the white settlers. So of this gathering and feast, Winslow wrote that Governor Bradford of the Plymouth colony sent men out to hunt wild fowl, which is most likely goose or duck, while Wampanoag Indians brought deer to the feast. And while turkeys were actually plentiful in New England in the 1620s, historians agree that it is really unlikely that they were the centerpiece of the first Thanksgiving. Another Thanksgiving myth debunked. Turkeys were hard to catch and their meat was tough and lean. So even if you could catch a turkey, you probably wouldn't want to eat it. Fish, however, would have been plentiful and almost certainly part of any harvest celebration, including shellfish. So actually, I guess on this image, what is correct is the pile of oyster shells at the bottom of the image. The Pilgrims may have stuffed their birds, though not likely turkeys, with onions and herbs. And cranberries are native to New England and would have been part of this native diet in the 1620s. So they may have been part of the Thanksgiving meal too. If cranberries were in a sauce of some sort, the sauce would have been sweetened with maple syrup. And we also know that pumpkin, a type of squash, was eaten in 1620s New England, but there was no flour and no pie. So no turkey, no pie, no bread for stuffing, and no apples. Apples were introduced to by colonists to the Americas a bit later in the 17th century. There were crab apples, but no kind of the eating apple we imagine today. Certainly no marshmallows on sweet potatoes, but there would have been fish and plenty of it, and shellfish and maybe cranberries. Oh, those are supposed to be next to each other. It's a little hard to see, but we can look at the Pilgrim Ale beer tray instead. But it wasn't all food, right? So you would have to have something to wash it down with it as well. And at the time that the Pilgrims arrived, the preferred drink for everyone, adults and children in England, was beer. Here, I'll just fix, whoops, oh boy, I'll fix this quickly so you can see it because it is kind of neat. There we go. So the preferred drink for everyone, adults and children in England, was beer. They drank a specific low alcohol style of beer that provided calories and safe drinking water. The first brewery in North America actually opened in 1612 in New Amsterdam, which is now New York City. It was started by Dutch colonists to that area. But of course, they weren't exporting beer to Massachusetts. And they could have been drinking some sort of fermented drink, maybe made from pumpkins or crab apples, but there's not really evidence of that, and they don't talk about it as much. And then there's the story of the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock because the ship they were on ran out of beer. Some of you may have heard this or read about this. What actually is true is that the Pilgrims were a religious group that were escaping persecution in England. They hired a boat called the Mayflower, and they were attempting to go to the Hudson River area of what is now New York State to settle, which would have made sense. The New York, what's now New York City, was already a Dutch colony. They were already making beer there. But what happened was that the ship got a late start. It had to turn back to England. The journey was pretty arduous. And when they got to the Atlantic coast, they ran into really high winds, and it was already November. So they landed on what's now Cape Cod. They attempted to continue to New York City, but the weather was making it so that wasn't really possible. So they kind of sailed around on Cape Cod and sailed up to where Plymouth is now. And over that first winter, some of the Pilgrims were still living in the ship with the sailors while they were building housing for everyone. And the sailors and the crew did actually keep the beer for the sailors, the captain was a bit concerned about running out of beer for the crew on the return trip to England. So it's not that they ran out and had to land and kicked out the pilgrims. Some of the pilgrims did write in their diaries and letters that they wished they were given more beer by the crew and the captain, but that the crew and captain were saving it for the return trip home. And then the Mayflower did set sail back to England in the spring of 1621. So we're not totally sure what they were drinking, but most likely something fermented with whatever fermentable thing they had on hand, maybe some pumpkin or some other fruit. But I can say with confidence that if given the choice, the pilgrims themselves would have been having beer at the first Thanksgiving. And this is actually an ad for Pilgrim Ale, which was brewed by Croft Brewing Company of Boston in the 1930s. On the left, you see a beer tray. So those were kind of promotional pieces that were given to taverns, bars, restaurants to serve beer on. And there is an ad from the 30s on the right connecting the history of Pilgrim Ale to the original Pilgrims. And their tagline, I just think is hilarious: the ale that's aged. So Thanksgiving in the United States did not become a national holiday until the Civil War. And we'll talk about how and why in just a minute. But Thanksgiving did exist before that. In 1789, George Washington actually issued a Thanksgiving proclamation. He created a day of public thanks. This was a printed version of the proclamation. And he said, "Now, therefore, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of November, to be devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being, who is the beneficent author of all that the good that was, that is, or that will be. That we may then all unite in rendering unto him our sincere and humble thanks for his kind care and protection of the people of this country previous to their becoming a nation, for the signal and manifold mercies and the favorable interpositions of his providence, which we experienced in the course and conclusion of the late war, for the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have been enabled to establish constitutions of government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one now lately instituted, for the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed, and the means we have of acquiring and diffusing useful knowledge, and in general, for all the great and various favors which he hath been pleased to confer upon us." So Washington's Thanksgiving, as you can hear from his proclamation, was pretty solemn and serious, and it had strong ties to Protestant notions of religious devotion and country. And then after 1789, when Thanksgiving was celebrated, it wasn't really done in any kind of nationwide or systemic way, and it continued to be a really serious and somber affair when it was marked. That was until the country met Sarah Josepha Hale. There she is. So with very little historical basis on which to create a shared national holiday, America actually needed someone to tell them how a holiday should be celebrated. And Sarah Josepha Buell Hale was just the woman for the job. Hale was born in New Hampshire, and she then lived in Boston and later Philadelphia. And she was the editor of Godey's Ladies Book, which was a popular women's magazine in the mid-19th century. She wanted to create an American tradition that brought people together. And according to historian Anne Blue Wills, she wanted to harken back to the rural Protestant foundations of the country. When she started writing in the 1830s, there was a huge influx of immigrants coming to the United States. And there was a general sense at the time that those new groups that were coming were really a threat to the Protestant values of American society. So when Sarah Josepha Hale starts writing about this need to have a national holiday, what she's really saying is that we need a national holiday to show the immigrants how to be good Protestant Americans. So she wrote about Thanksgiving often in Godey's Ladies Book. And the first time she actually wrote about was in a novel. She was a kind of a prolific writer. So she wrote a novel called Northwood, A Tale of New England, that was published in 1827. And she describes this Thanksgiving meal that they have. And it's actually really worth reading the whole thing aloud, because today is, I always, when I like to read Northwood, I think about food writers of today, right? And how I just feel like they have so much to learn about how she paints the picture of what's on the table. So she said, talking about the feast, The roasted turkey took precedence on this occasion, being placed at the head of the table, and well did it become its lordly station, sending forth the rich odor of its savory stuffing, and finely covered with the frost of the basting. At the foot of the board, a sirloin of beef, flanked on either side by a leg of pork and joint of mutton, seemed placed as a basting to defend innumerable bowls of gravy and plates of vegetables disposed in that quarter. A good and pair of ducklings occupied side stations on the table, the middle being graced, as it always is on such occasions, by that rich burgomaster of the provisions called a chicken pie. This pie, which is wholly formed by the choicest parts of fowls, enriched and seasoned with a profusion of butter and pepper, and covered with an excellent puff paste, is, like the celebrated pumpkin pie, an indispensable part of a good and true Yankee Thanksgiving. The size of the pie usually denoting the gratitude of the party who prepares the feast. Plates of pickles, preserves, and butter, and all the necessaries for increasing the seasoning of the viands to the demands of each palate, filled the interstices of the table, leaving hardly sufficient room for the plates of the company, a wine glass and 2 tumblers for each, with a slice of wheat bread lying on one of the inverted tumblers. A side table was literally loaded with the preparations for the second course, placed there to obviate the necessity of leaving the apartment during the repast. There was a huge plum pudding, custards, and pies of every name and description ever known in Yankee land. Yet the pumpkin pie occupied the most distinguished niche. There were also several kinds of rich cake and a variety of sweetmeats and fruits. On the sideboard was ranged a good number of decanters and bottles, the former filled with currant wine and the latter with excellent cider and ginger beer. There were no foreign wines or ardent spirits. So, I mean, I'd go to that dinner. I don't know if folks feel that way, but this vision of an overflowing, plentiful feast table also represented the mid-19th century ideals of a woman's role in creating a perfect home. And that was a vision that Hale spread through her editorials each November in Godey's, detailing exactly how women should prepare and celebrate the Thanksgiving feast in the home. Her writing in Godey's featured recipes for turkey and stuffing and pie. And really, she actually wrote her classic American Thanksgiving. She wrote it down on paper, then she wrote the recipes and told people how to make it. And at the very end, she talks about what they were drinking and mentions, that they had cider and currant wine, but she says, no foreign wines or ardent spirits. So the 1830s was also a time where really ideas about drinking and prohibition were really changing in the United States. The temperance movement was really just getting started. And there are really strong links between temperance and anti-immigrant sentiment. So when she says foreign wines and ardent spirits, what she's actually saying is kind of code for the drinks that immigrants drink were not served at this table. Because a lot of immigrant groups that came to the United States in the 1830s had drinking customs that they brought with them. So some of them were, Irish workers building the canals. There were Italian Americans who were working even in the granite mines of Barry. German immigrants moving to New York City, bringing a beer drinking tradition with them. So what she's pointing out over and over again is that there is a certain way to be American. That way involves eating turkey. I will tell you how to cook it, and I will tell you what not to do. And then she wrote a letter, a now infamous letter, and here it is. As the United States was divided by the Civil War, she wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln, who was president, urging him to make Thanksgiving a national event, one that would bring Americans together during the divided days of the Civil War. And here's a copy of the letter, and that's as she wrote it. And on October 3rd, 1863, Lincoln does just that, declaring the last Thursday in November a, quote, day of thanksgiving and praise. And this is an image that was it's in the National Museum of American History's Political History collection. It's from Harpers Weekly. It's a double fold, right? So the magazine would have been open. So the center fold of the magazine. It's from 1864. So the Civil War is still happening when this is printed. And it talks about Thanksgiving Day of 1864. And there's actually pretty amazing scenes in here that are happening throughout the country. So, right, you have Abraham Lincoln in the middle. At the very bottom, you have the generals who they call the peacemakers. They say, blessed are the peacemakers. The top left, it actually says, thank God for Maryland freeing her slaves. And on the right, it says, thank God for Union victories. So Thanksgiving is really, the Civil War is a time of tremendous loss of life, right? There's so many people who are killed during the Civil War on both sides. And there's a need to grieve and come together and kind of rebuild the nation. And that's what Sarah Josepha Hale was aiming for. And that's what Lincoln took it to mean and said about it. So after Lincoln's proclamation, Americans really embrace Thanksgiving, and it becomes a truly national holiday. But it doesn't actually become enshrined by Congress until the tail end of the Great Depression. Lincoln's proclamation marked the last Thursday in November as Thanksgiving. But in 1939, the last Thursday of November was going to be on November 30th, which was the final day of the month. The National Retailers Association came to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and urged him to move Thanksgiving to create a longer shopping season between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So FDR, who was always looking for ways to encourage spending and get the country out of the Great Depression, he issued his own proclamation and moved the date of Thanksgiving to the second to last Thursday in November. So all these presidential proclamations I've been talking about, they don't actually make federal holidays. They don't change the dates of the holidays. So after FDR issues his proclamation, 32 states actually issued their own proclamations, and they change the date to the second to last Thursday. But 16 states refused to change the date. So for 2 years, there's actually 2 Thanksgivings celebrated at different times in different parts of the country. And in 1941, Congress stepped in to lock down the date once and for all. On October 6, 1941, this is, the House passed a joint resolution, which you see here. This is part of a Library of Congress document, naming the last Thursday in November as Thanksgiving, but does not solve the problem. That was then amended by the stoic compromisers of the Senate, who clarified that it should be the 4th Thursday in Thanksgiving, in case there happened to be 5 Thursdays. And that was that. 1941, Thanksgiving officially becomes the holiday we know and love. You might think that maybe FDR and Congress had other things to worry about in 1941, but this is the crucial work of government, is setting these important dates. So now I'm going to turn from how we got Thanksgiving to talk a little bit about each of the dishes that we associate with Thanksgiving. And actually, much of what we think of as Thanksgiving food has more to do with industrialization and innovation of American food in the 20th century than anything that it does to have to do with what they actually ate in 1621. So through these food innovations in the mid-20th century, every American home could have a traditional Thanksgiving that meshed with the 20th century vision of a modern America. So nowadays, our Thanksgiving feast is as much a tribute to the mid-20th century modernist ideal as it is to a 19th century idealized view of our 17th century origin story. So as America entered the 20th century, Americans tweaked their Thanksgiving foods to reflect the modern vision of America. Progress, innovation, and technology all became part of the Thanksgiving table. So we'll start with my beloved cranberry sauce. Cranberries were actually too delicate to transport long distances. So in the early 20th century, they were consumed mostly in New England, where they were grown. And this image is from an early 20th century shipping crate for the brand Eat More Cranberries of New Jersey. And it's part of the collection of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. But in 1912, Marcus Urin, who was head of the United Cape Cod Cranberry Company, he started selling and packaging canned cranberry sauce and juice. He was a cranberry bog owner, and he wanted to preserve the product and support cranberry growers. And in the 1930s, he created a cooperative that would protect growers from market and crop volatility over time. In 1946, that cooperative became the National Cranberry Association, and in 1957, changed its name to Ocean Spray Cranberries. So the cranberry log, as we know it today, actually came out in 1941. I personally love canned cranberry sauce in a completely not ironic way. I think it is a hallmark of Thanksgiving and just amazing about how you can just push it out of the can and slice it on the line. So I know that's a controversial opinion, but I will stand by that and say that I think it's an important part of the Thanksgiving table, at least to me. And I love this idea that it had to be invented, right? Someone had to invent this as a way to preserve and sell more cranberries. And stuffing too actually gets a modern upgrade in the 20th century. The convenience food revolution of the mid-1900s introduced pre-packaged stuffing mixes to the home kitchen. So perfect stuffing became as easy as adding chicken broth. Now, the one that comes to mind first is, of course, stovetop. And stovetop was invented, as a lot of these foods were invented. Stovetop was invented by Ruth Seams while she was working for General Foods. And she actually holds a patent for it, which you can see here on the left. And the patent specifically is about the size of the breadcrumbs for rehydration. She received her patent in 1975. And of course, this brings up in all Thanksgivings, the great stuffing versus dressing debate. Is it a stuffing or is it a dressing? You may all have opinions about that. Generally, dressing is mostly used in the southern United States, but there's some folks who believe it's only stuffing when it's inside the bird and dressing when it's on the side. But mostly in the north, the northern states, it's called. I have heard it called stuffing. Also, potentially controversial or maybe classic are oysters and your oyster stuffing. So oysters would have been the most historically accurate thing, and are the most historically accurate thing you can serve at Thanksgiving. Shellfish, really plentiful in 1621 in New England. But including oysters in your stuffing was also part of Northwood's, Sarah Josepha Hale's book. And oysters were a huge part of the 19th century diet, especially in New York and New England metropolitan areas. The mid 19th century had just tons of oysters. And if you're interested, there's a great book about oysters called Urban Appetites by Cindy Lobel that really talks about the important role that oysters had in specifically New York City food culture and the economy of New York City. So oysters would have been very appropriate for the mid 19th century as well. But I will leave that up to you. I did threaten to serve only oysters and fish at my family Thanksgiving, and my brother-in-law told me he would not come. So I might have to amend that for this year. So these same convenience foods in the home earned green bean casserole a place at the Thanksgiving table in the mid 20th century. Campbell's Soup Company published the first recipe for green bean casserole in 1955. They were trying to create a recipe that was made up entirely of things that the average cook would have on hand. The recipe, which has remained the same for over 50 years, uses their cream of mushroom soup, crispy onions, and green beans. It was created by a woman named Dorcas Riley. Again, invented. It was an invented food, but it was created by Dorcas Riley, who worked in the home economics department at Campbell's Test Kitchen in Camden, New Jersey. And in 2015, Campbell's reported that 40% of their sales of cream of mushroom soup nationally go into green bean casserole. So at this point, I think they're just producing it for the green bean casserole. So even pies took a turn towards convenience with the introduction of canned pureed pumpkin. Today, the vast majority of pumpkins grown in the United States are turned into canned pumpkin puree, which then takes away the need to bake and mash your own pumpkin. Libby's Pumpkin, the brand you're most familiar with probably, they actually started canning pumpkin in 1929. But today, the largest producer of pumpkin in the United States is a farm called Frey Farms. It's actually owned by a female farmer named Sarah Frey. And back to the drinks. There were, particularly in the mid-19th century, or mid-20th century, sorry, there were so many advertising campaigns trying to convince people to drink beer at their Thanksgiving dinner. There's just a few of them here. The one on the left talks about Pabst Blue Ribbon. And you see, of course, a man enjoying a Pabst Blue Ribbon while carving a turkey. And on the right, there was a campaign from the National Brewers Foundation in 1949. It was called the Beer Belongs campaign. So their idea was to say that they called beer America's beverage of moderation. And they had a whole ad campaign where they had always white families coming together around tables at parties, having a great time, and reminding people that beer is something to enjoy in moderation. There's also ad campaigns about the cocktails you're going to serve at your Thanksgiving dinner. The wine industry even gets into it. Of course, in the 50s, the American alcohol industry is really just coming out of Prohibition. So what you have are, the wine industry is just barely rebuilding. The brewing industry is just a couple of major producers that actually made it through Prohibition. And they're kind of reteaching Americans how to make alcohol part of eating again. And you can see there's a lot of great ads about that. And I mentioned at the beginning, marshmallows. So we have to talk about sweet potato casserole. Putting marshmallows on top of an already sweet vegetable and eating it at a savory meal isn't my thing. But for some people, Thanksgiving just isn't Thanksgiving without sweet potato casserole. So Angelus Marshmallows is actually credited with creating the dish in 1917. Angelus sold mass-produced marshmallows starting in 1907. And they were looking for, of course, a way to sell more marshmallows. These are images that you see here from the 1927 Angelus Marshmallow Cookbook, which also includes such hits as marshmallow gelatin, marshmallow salad, and Cracker Jack fluff. Angelus Marshmallows was actually the same company that owned Cracker Jacks. So if you own two amazing sweets, I guess you can mush them together and have Cracker Jack fluff. But again, if we go back to Northwood's, the 19th century feast, the sweet dishes are actually served right at the same table. So in some ways, the sweet potato casserole reflects both 20th century mass production of food and the 19th century feast from Sarah Hale. In fact, in 1887, Godey's Lady's Book, Sarah Josepha Hale was the editor, Godey's Lady's Book published a recipe for sweet potato pie and said that it could be served as part of the meal or as dessert, leaving it up to the people creating the meal. And of course, here is one of, if not the iconic image of the American Thanksgiving, Norman Rockwell's Freedom from Want. In 1943, Rockwell painted a series of paintings inspired by FDR's For Freedom speech. The paintings were published in the Saturday Evening Post alongside an essay by a Filipino immigrant and writer who really just wasn't experiencing the America depicted in the picture. And I think that's we see this image, right? And we think of Thanksgiving and bounty, but what the Saturday Evening Post did was publish this really amazing essay by this Filipino immigrant talking about how hard it was to come to the United States and how he was not experiencing this vision of plenty. He wasn't experiencing the American dream. So throughout the history of celebrating Thanksgiving, Americans have looked to the past and created new food traditions that help them understand their world and their identity. Today's Thanksgiving continues to recreate the meal to fit our version of the America we want to have. Instead of feasts of plenty, the modern day Sarah Hale may write about the importance of heritage turkeys or locally grown green beans on the Thanksgiving table as a way to represent some American value. But the emphasis remains the same. American food reflects who Americans are and who Americans want themselves to be, as complicated and multifaceted as that is. But I believe that the real value of Thanksgiving is its emphasis on the creative power of the American people to create new traditions that reflect their own experiences, while also reveling in traditions of the past. And this year, that will hold more true than ever as we try to hold on to some traditions or recreate traditions as we hopefully are gathering again around tables safely and with a renewed commitment to coming together around the table. I hope you enjoy your Thanksgiving with your friends and family. So let me go back to the chat and I'll take a quick look through and I'd be happy to take questions if folks have them. They can put them in the chat. I think there were some that came in. There's a specific one about the turkey salt shaker that I do not know the answer to, where the salt comes out. But some of the salt shakers are pretty comical. So you can imagine where the salt might come out. Someone also mentioned oyster casserole. Yes, oyster casserole, some oyster stuffings too.
What was the book that has the history of oysters?
It's called Urban Appetites. It's by the author's name, Cindy Lobel.
Okay. anybody has any questions, you can type them into the chat or any comments. Jello salads. There's
Jello salads. What's not about Jello salads? Jello is, yes, it fits into that. Sorry, I was just going to say Jello fits into that same mold of mid 20th century progress, but it's a little too obvious. But Jello is part of that mid 20th century modernization story. And a lot of the mid 20th century modernized foods really come out of the post World War II era, where many women are working out of the home, starting to work out of the home more. There is actually less time for doing the things that women have traditionally done and taken a lot of time to do. So they start having all these packaged convenience foods. Jello becomes one of them, and there's all sorts of recipes and booklets and tips and tricks for how to make your Jello salad. I think there's a Jello marshmallow salad in the Angelus Marshmallows recipe in the Angelus Marshmallows cookbook. But the thing that I like to emphasize on all of these modern and convenience foods that come out in the mid 20th century is that they're modern and convenient, but the message behind them is still that women are the ones who should be making them. So even as women are starting to spend more time out of the home, working, getting jobs, the societal expectation is still that women are the ones doing the cooking. While at the same time, often, we still see this today, the chefs in fancy restaurants who lead kitchens and have positions of leadership are often men. So there always tends to be this disconnect in the 20th century between this idea of convenience and fanciness and who has to do the work on which side. So there's a question about mincemeat pie, which is a great one. I don't know a lot about mincemeat pie. My understanding is that it is from England originally. Mincemeat pie does actually involve meat and sugar and raisins, and it's cured sometimes with some kind of alcohol in it. I'm not a mincemeat pie expert myself, but the idea, I believe, with mincemeat is that it's just another way of keeping meat for longer by kind of adding alcohol and dried fruit to it, and is popular in pie form. If anyone has good resources on mincemeat history, please pop them in the chat too. I'd love to read them. Another question is, when did the real industrialization of turkey production begin? There have, throughout the 20th century, tons and tons of changes in modern agricultural production and production of all of the foods that we consume and buy. I don't know the timeline on when that happened, but most of it came out of that same post-World War II kind of new technologies that were allowing farming to be different and more more of it happening in smaller spaces. So there were new, technologies, new farming technologies, and farming technologies including fertilizers, and a lot of the fertilizers that are used in agriculture directly came out of World War I and World War II. World War I and World War II. So they all kind of start after that. Okay, great question. Why is pie predominant over cake or cookies at Thanksgiving? My theory on the pie part is that actually does come directly out of Northwood. She talks a lot about pie. Pie was more common, maybe not more common. Pie was common in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it just kind of stuck with us. Not that cakes and cookies have not always been popular, but I will say that probably is from Northwoods originally. Stouffer. Oh, that's a neat story. Someone grew up in Tarrytown and was taken to the Stovetop Stuffing headquarters in White Plains, New York on a school field trip. Another question about mashed potatoes and when those became part of the picture. Mashed potatoes follow a similar trajectory to a lot of these foods, that they started producing instant mashed potatoes in the mid 20th century as well. Same idea with this convenience food revolution, that would take less time. You could get the women of the family could take less time to get food on the table. I don't remember, I think she talks about potatoes in Northwood, but potatoes would have, been a common food in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the instant mashed potato was a mid 20th century invention. Same with creamed onions. There's a question about creamed onions coming out in the 1950s. I think it depends on how you make your creamed onions, actually. Creamed onions with cream of some onion soup, I guess, would be mid 20th century. Creamed onions actually were a 19th century food, a more common 19th century food too. So again, almost all of these foods, right? They were maybe more common in the 19th century, and then they had a mid 20th century technological twist on them. There's someone who mentioned they don't think they're brave enough to try oyster stuffing, but I would encourage you all to. That's many takeaways from tonight, hopefully about the complexity of America and identity and who gets to decide what is American, but also to eat shellfish at Thanksgiving. That's the big takeaway, I think.
Any other questions?
Oh, a really good comment about steamed pudding and hard sauce, which is another originally British dish as well. Hard sauce being called hard because it was has brandy in it. We light it on fire.
This is great. Oh, there's another. Black Americans have different Thanksgiving traditions.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. Different Thanksgivings for African American families, Black American families. Because Thanksgiving was a Civil War tradition, it was actually really embraced by the African American community as part of that post-Civil War celebrations of kind of the ending of slavery. A lot of the foods and traditions that I've researched of African American families and Thanksgiving are more geographic. So you see Southern families often have often have foods that we would consider Southern foods at the table, if it was macaroni and cheese or collard greens. And those are foods that African Americans actually were created. Most of the foods that we imagine as most of the foods we think of as Southern foods today are African American foods. A lot of them were created because of the horrible, inhumane conditions of enslavement that African Americans had to create food out of what they had. They were not given enough food to eat and survive. So they were very ingenious and made things really delicious out of what they had around them. And now those foods are traditionally considered Southern food, but actually they're African American food. Those traditions actually moved with African Americans as many African Americans moved north during the Great Migration in the early to mid 20th century. So a lot of those foods would actually move with the families and continue to be part of an African American Thanksgiving tradition. But yes, Thanksgiving was actually really embraced by African Americans in the research that I've seen and done because of its connection to the ending of enslavement and the Civil War. So two questions about, a question about Indian pudding and grits, which are different, but I would say the question was, is Indian pudding a tradition? And what I always say about traditions is if it's a tradition to you, it's a tradition. Indian pudding is a New England food, and I hope I'm describing it right. It is like a baked corn pudding is what I think of it as. If I said that wrong, please correct me in the chat. And it is served usually as a side dish. Grits, another corn-based food. Do grits have a place with Thanksgiving? Again, like I would say, if it has a place for you at Thanksgiving, it has a place at Thanksgiving. But grits, I would associate more also with the Southern American food traditions. They were not, when it comes to the 19th century creation of Thanksgiving, they're not really listed as part of the feast that Sarah Josepha Hale mentions. But again, she is presenting her version of an idealized Protestant white New England Thanksgiving. She's really creating this New England mythology that we identify and see today. These are really great questions and making me really excited for Thanksgiving. Yes, Indian pudding is a dessert cornmeal. It's a dessert, cornmeal, molasses, eggs, milk. Was lobster served at the first Thanksgiving? Most likely, yes. Shellfish, lobster, clams, oysters, any shellfish that would have been off the coast of New England and plentiful at the time probably would have been part of it. Yes.